It is my great pleasure to introduce Stanley Pollack. Stanley Pollack is the Assistant Attorney General for the Water Rights Unit of the Navajo Nation Department of Justice in Window Rock, Arizona. Since 1985, he has represented the Navajo Nation in all matters affecting the nation's water resources, including 5 general stream adjudications in Arizona and New Mexico, and in Navajo Nation v. Department of Interior, an action in federal court alleging the Secretary breached her trust responsibilities to the Navajo Nation in the development and management of various programs on the Colorado River. He negotiated the Navajo Nation San Juan River Basin in New Mexico water rights settlement approved by Congress in 2009 and is defending that settlement before the New Mexico Court of Appeals. He led negotiations on behalf of the Navajo Nation and the state of Utah, which resulted in a settlement recently approved by the Navajo Nation Council. Please join me in welcoming Stanley Pollack.
Thank you, Blaine. Sorry to intrude on your lunch, but we wanted to get going, so I didn't want to hold everything up this afternoon. So what I'd like to do is talk about various Colorado River issues and how the compacts put different constraints on Navajo water development, and particularly in the context of drinking water projects. So I start off with the iconic shot of the Grand Canyon, Colorado River in the Grand Canyon, taken at Nankoweap Ruin. I have to include these in here because the more of these pictures I have, the more justification I have for doing river trips. And so there's a couple of things I want to point out here. So this is the Colorado River. This land here is the Navajo Nation. So when you're going down the Colorado River, the left bank is basically Navajo land. And when you talk about trying to get water out of the Colorado River and deliver it to Navajo land, you can see that it's a daunting challenge, just the amount of lift that would be involved to try to get the water out. Just a few miles upstream where this picture is taken, at Badger Rapid, mile 30 in the Grand Canyon, there's actually a side canyon that goes down to the Colorado River called Badger Canyon on the non-Navajo side, and on the Navajo side, the canyon is called Jackass Canyon. And so I was at a meeting, 15 years ago or so with the governor of Arizona, Janet Napolitano. I was explaining to her some plans that we were looking at to basically build an intake on the Colorado River to get water out for the Navajo Nation at Jackass Canyon. And I was explaining the whole Jackass Canyon proposal. The governor turns to me and she goes, I don't know if you like this proposal, but you seem to really just like Jackass Canyon. So I said, Governor, when you've worked for the Navajo Nation as long as I have, maybe they'll name a canyon after you too. So with that said, the primary focus of what I want to talk about is the need to get drinking water to the Navajo people, where in many areas of the reservation, 30–40% the people haul water. And so that's the focus of the projects I want to talk about. This particular piece of artwork was done by an elementary school kid in, I believe, in Lake Valley, New Mexico. When they were having hearings on the Navajo Gallup Water Supply Project, a number of the children submitted artwork trying to depict what water meant to them and the importance of water. And what we were struck by was the number of pieces of artwork that children developed that actually featured trucks hauling water. And so what we realized is we are creating generations of children that think that water is something, it's not something that comes out of a faucet. It doesn't come from a kitchen. It doesn't come from the source like that. It comes from the back of a pickup truck. And so that's the kind of poverty, that's the kind of conditions that we're trying to correct. And we're using, as a water rights attorney, I'm using the opportunity to settle water rights litigations as a tool to try to get drinking water to the Navajo people. So to try to put an end to the generational gap where people think that water comes from a truck and not from a faucet. I want to start with, I remember last night David Robbins was saying, well, these are my own comments and they don't reflect anybody. And I guess I'm going to give you my observations of Navajo life, Navajo culture, and they're just my observations. I can't say that anybody else shares them. So what I'm showing you here is the basic, let's imagine, if you will, Aboriginal people living in an Aboriginal homeland before the arrival of the Europeans. This is more or less what it would look like. And actually, this is from a Google. They obviously didn't have Google in Aboriginal times, nor did they have Lake Powell, Navajo Reservoir, or any of that, or even the Navajo Indian Irrigation Project here. But stripped to its essence, you have a high desert country with not a lot of development. And of course, in those times, not a lot of lines on a map, people telling you where to go. So that's the backdrop that I wanted to portray. So Denetah, which would represent the traditional homeland of the Navajo people, is the land that's found within the 4 sacred mountains, which is an important part of the Navajo cultural history, the lands within the 4 sacred mountains. So I've just tried to strip that photo into sort of a chart here. And you can see this is Canyon de Chelly, Colorado River, San Juan River, the Rio Grande. And so you've got the 4 sacred mountains that form the basic homeland. So you've got people out there living as they have in a pastoral existence for several hundred years. And then as Justice Hobbs told us this morning, that Kit Carson rounded up a lot of the Navajos. A lot of them were rounded up out of the Canyon de Chelly area, and they marched them off to Fort Sumner, to the Bosque Redondo, where it was the beginning of the Navajo genocide, where thousands of Navajos perished from malnutrition and disease. Eventually, they were allowed to return to their homeland. Is there a pointer on? Yes. To this reservation that was established. So now you have some lines on a map for the first time saying, here's some reservation boundaries. But there were still Navajos living everywhere in this 4 sacred mountain area, not just on the reservation. Lines on the map start appearing. And then some more lines are drawn, the creations of the states. So now you have Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. So New Mexico and Arizona, all of a sudden you have state lines showing up. I'm going to just walk over here because it's a little easier. Showing up, dividing the land into something called states, which states are a bit of anathema to the Navajo people. It's not part of their culture. It's not part of their political structure. But in any event, you've got these lines that say, you are now an Arizonan in 1912, you are now a New Mexican, or from Utah as well. So Navajos in those states. And then all of a sudden, in 1922, someone comes along and says, at this point, called Lee Ferry, we're going to divide the Colorado River Basin into an upper basin and a lower basin. And it's like, huh, what's this? Who drew these lines on a map to determine these basin boundaries? The point being, people were living they're perfectly happy living where they were living, and now all of a sudden they're told there are a number of political limitations to the way you're going to live based on a number of lines that are drawn on a map. This is not new in Indian country. There's a family that lives basically in Wapatki National Monument outside of Flagstaff, the Peshlakai family. Their descendants have lived there for hundreds of years. One day, someone from the federal government shows up on their lands and says, you know what, you're trespassing. Congress has determined this land is a national monument, and you people are in trespass. Or in a larger scale, Navajos living on the Black Mesa area were told, for hundreds of years, were told, a 3-judge panel drew some lines on a map and said, this is now Hopi land, you're going to have to move. And so you have these political constraints telling people where they can live and what they can do. And that's basically what I want to talk about, those constraints that tell Navajo what you can and you can't do in terms of how you want to develop your water. So when these boundaries, this dividing point, Lee Ferry, was established in 1922, my client always says, why wasn't the Navajo Nation at the negotiation table when the Colorado River Compact was signed? Where was the Navajo Nation? And I'm like, my response is, well, you think about the big picture here. In 1922, No one even recognized Indian people as being citizens of the United States. They didn't get citizenship until 1924. Why would you be at a table having discussions with people that didn't even recognize you as being citizens of their country? Now, so what you have in the Colorado River Compact is some interesting language in Article 7, which Herbert Hoover brought to the table. At the time, it was referred to as the wild Indian language, because they knew that there was a decision that had come out of the Supreme Court in Winters versus United States saying that tribes had water rights, but nobody really knew what that meant, and nobody really wanted to they weren't about to allocate water to the tribes as part of the Colorado River Compact process. So they have the language: nothing in this compact shall be construed as affecting the obligation of the United States to Indian tribes. Okay, so as a water lawyer for the Navajo Nation, this is my Bible when I talk about the Colorado River, and it's like, hey, your rules do not apply to the tribes. The lines on the map, the basin boundaries, they shouldn't apply to the tribes. So we'll get to that in a second. So here's what the consequences of all this are. This is the Navajo Nation right here, and you can see this is your typical basin map courtesy of the Bureau of Reclamation. The Navajo Nation finds itself almost entirely within the Colorado River Basin, both in the upper basin, the lower basin, and in the 3 states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. So this is kind of my job description right here. It shows you why the work that I do for the Navajo Nation is so difficult and is so complicated, because of all these different characteristics, all these different political subdivisions. So ask ourselves, why are the compacts relevant? Why do I spend so much time worrying about the law of the river and the compacts if, in fact, the compacts really are not intended to apply to Indian tribes? So this is, I guess, Chuck will really love this slide. This is the signing of the Colorado River Basin Project Act, 1968. And of course, this is the Central Arizona Project. So what's the point of this slide? So Chuck saved me the task of having to explain the whole story of how, when Arizona kicked butt in Arizona versus California, and as an attorney for the Navajo Nation, I can continue to litigate, and maybe using the tools or the arrows in my quiver, the Winters Doctrine, practically irrigable acreage, maybe we can get some great water rights for the Navajo Nation. But at the end of the day, when you're talking about water development, and you have to go to Congress to get that water development, those that have the power will use the power. So litigation itself is basically a hollow exercise. Litigation yields paper water rights. The people I represent can't drink a drop of water from the paper that I might obtain in litigation. Just the same way as Arizona, in Arizona versus California, they obtained a paper water right to 2.8 million acre feet of water. They couldn't use it, though. They had to go to Congress. So it's all well and good to stand up here. I can beat my chest and tell all of you, you know what, these rules don't apply to Navajo. By the terms of the compact itself, it appears it wasn't intended to apply to Navajo. These are arbitrary lines on a map. But the practical reality is the rules do apply, because when Navajo wants to develop its water, when it goes to Congress, and it needs the funding necessary. It's very expensive to develop water. When you have to go to Congress to get that authorization, you're going to have to make sure that what you're doing fits within the system, the political system that others have set up. And the way in Navajo, we refer to the Congress in DC as Washington. And so my advice is always, when you go to Washington, you're playing the white man's game. When you play the white man's game, you play by the white man's rules. So what are the consequences? Before I get into that, here's a slide of something I found to be very interesting. The Navajo Nation This is the Arizona-New Mexico boundary in the area around Window Rock, Arizona. Window Rock's where I live and work. And you'll see we have water systems that cross state lines. They go back and forth all the way up and down the Arizona-New Mexico boundary. When we were sitting down and negotiating Navajo water rights with the state of New Mexico, one of the Navajos at the table turned to the state engineer and said, "These state lines are figments of your imagination. You have rules about moving. We do this every day. We're moving water back and forth across the state lines in violation of all the rules that you have." And why can we do that? Well, because we built systems that really didn't require Navajos to go to Congress where these rules would be laid out. But certainly in the context of the negotiations with the state, we had to deal with how water would be treated when we're crossing state lines. But the point is, these boundaries are figments of their imaginations. All right, there's an awful lot of information on this slide. I violated the number one rule, never put a lot of information. The gist of this, as Justice Hobbs pointed out this morning, is when we talk about the Colorado River Basin, we're not just talking about that map showing you where the watersheds are. We're talking about an area that can be served by the waters of the Colorado River. So think of the Colorado River Basin essentially as 7 states. It's those portions of the state that can be served with water from the Colorado River system. It's not just the water within the system. And that has some important ramifications. We'll get into these definitions a little later. Interestingly enough, the upper basin is those parts of those upper basin states that are served from waters diverted above Lee Ferry. So, let's see, the lower basin are those parts that are located in the state without the drainage of the Colorado River system. So what that means is, so in both the upper basin and the lower basin, any part of the state is really part of the upper basin as long as it can be served with waters above Lee Ferry, except if it's waters, except if it's an area that's in the lower basin. You get where I'm going? The lower basin is not part of the upper basin. That's the only part of the state, that's the only part of the lands in the state that are considered part of the Colorado River Basin. I'll show you how this plays out for Navajo. So, we have the Navajo Nation, San Juan River Basin and New Mexico Water Rights Settlement. Here's the Navajo Nation, here's the San Juan River Basin, signing ceremony, big water settlement we did at Crua back in 2010. The centerpiece of that settlement, again, thinking drinking water projects for the people, is the Navajo Gallup Water Supply Project. So here you have the San Juan River, you have 2 pipelines. These pipelines, are intended to serve a number of communities in New Mexico, communities that are located in the upper basin, communities located in the lower basin, communities located in the Rio Grande, and Arizona communities in the lower basin. So there's 4 different classes for purposes of delivery that we have to deal with. Now, delivering water from the San Juan River to communities in the upper basin, that's not a problem. Upper basin water being used in the upper basin of New Mexico, no problem there. Let's talk about the Rio Grande. So here, we're taking water from the San Juan River through this pipeline to, this is the Pueblo Pintado area. This is an area where there's a lot of water hauling. You may have seen the documentary on the Water Lady. It was on CBS Sunday Morning. If you've flown on Southwest recently, you've probably seen this article. This is the Navajo Water Lady, and she's a saint. And she runs around in this water truck delivering water to people that don't have water. These are the people that we're trying to serve. Now, what's interesting about this, again, going back to the definition, the Colorado River Basin is basically the Colorado River system and all those areas that you can serve. And the upper basin is those parts of the state of New Mexico that you can serve from the waters from the upper basin above Leaf Ferry, and also those parts of the state located without the drainage area of the Colorado River system. So sending water to the Rio Grande is absolutely no problem, even though it's not in the Colorado River Basin. But sending water to the lower basin, that's a problem, because the lower basin is not without the drainage area of the Colorado River system. It seems it's an odd paradox that the rules are set up to essentially encourage an out-of-basin use of water, use it in the Rio Grande, where there is no return flow to the Colorado River, but the rules are pretty much set up against using water in the lower basin, and I'll show you that in a second. So, lower basin. Again, taking water from pipelines, delivering it to communities in the area around Gallup, New Mexico. So here's a Navajo guy with his pickup truck filling up his water in Gallup, New Mexico. That's, again, that's the problem we're trying to address. Lower basin, we've gone through this before, those parts of New Mexico without the drainage area of the Colorado River system, outside the Colorado River system, that can be now or beneficially served by waters diverted from the system below Leaf Ferry. So if we go back to our map, you can see, again, if we are diverting out of the San Juan River, we are now above Leaf Ferry, and so we cannot serve the lower basin, because the lower basin can only be served from the Colorado River system if the water is taken below Leaf Ferry. So it created a conundrum. So we went to the Upper Colorado River Commission back in 2003. Don't have to read all this text. The important point is that the commission agreed that for purposes of this project in particular, they are going to allow an exception to the law of the river in saying you can deliver water from the upper basin to the lower basin, provided that you account for it as though it's water, even though it's being used in the lower basin, you're going to account for it as though it were an upper basin use. The water that you're using in the lower basin is no longer passing Leaf Ferry, so it's not going to count as a delivery to the lower basin, so we have to account for it as an upper basin use, even though it's a lower basin diversion. What's important about this kind of thing, this kind of slide, is that we think of the Colorado River, the law of the river, those sorts of, that it's somehow this monolithic force that drives all the decision making. And what a lot of the folks here what we're hearing is that there's a lot of flexibility. The states are working together to find collaborative solutions. And this is one of them. Having the states recognize there is a need to bring this water, and we got the commission to bless that particular concept. Now here's something that really gets tricky. Trying to get water from the upper basin in New Mexico down into the lower basin of Arizona in the Window Rock area. That's where I live. That's right outside my office. So what we had as part of the settlement, we had a very long term for the Navajo water settlement. It's called the Northwestern New Mexico Rural Water Projects Act, okay? And that act did a number of things. First, it actually ratified the action of the Upper Basin Commission saying this is okay. Accounting for water delivered to the lower basin as upper basin water, it's okay. We're going to do it here. But then it did something, and this is the Navajo Gallup project being constructed today. It also authorized the delivery of water from the upper basin in New Mexico into the lower basin in Arizona. And this is where things get really tricky. So there's a whole section of the act that has a long litany of conditions that must be met before we deliver water through this project to Navajo communities in Arizona. But the critical thing is that before any water is delivered, it must settle and waive the nation's claims to water in the lower basin and the Little Colorado River Basin in the state of Arizona. So what happened was when we went to Congress, and the initial legislation said simply, before we deliver water to the Arizona communities, we're going to need a contract for the secretary and the consent of the state of Arizona. That wasn't enough. Arizona insisted on, well, before you do that, you're going to have to settle these water rights in the Little Colorado River Basin, other water rights in the Colorado River Basin. Point of that is Arizona learned the lesson very, very well from California, which is when you want a water project and you've got the political muscle to block that project, you can start putting conditions on the delivery of that water. And that's what happened to Arizona in the Boulder Canyon Project Act, and so that's what the state of Arizona is doing to the Navajo Nation. You've got people there. We've got the water. There was 6411. This is the amount of water we need in the Window Rock portion. That was reserved in the Arizona Water Settlements Act in 2004. There's a block of water. We got the water. It's reserved. We have the infrastructure. The Navajo Gala project was authorized as part of the New Mexico settlement in 2009. And that infrastructure is being built without cost to the state of Arizona. It's being built on the backs of the New Mexico water settlement. We've got the water, we've got the need, the infrastructure, and we have the need. The supplies are limited. People are hauling water. And so they're putting these restrictions on because they can. They're putting the restrictions on because they learned the lesson from California. So when we were in the negotiations on the Colorado River, we saw these conditions. We had to come up with some props as part of our negotiation strategy. I actually thought, I could wear this today, but it would probably be better served to have a suit to talk to you. And we actually gave these as a present to Doug Miller, General Counsel for Central Arizona Water Project, at his retirement luncheon. So I hope he's wearing that and he gets the message. Stop making conditions. When you've got the water, you've got a pipeline, and you have people that are in need of water, get the water to them. Stop trying to extort conditions from these folks. So I never miss an opportunity to try to drive that home. All right, let's go back to these Arizona negotiations. One of the things that we talked about in the Arizona negotiations was trying to build a Western Navajo pipeline. And so you saw the picture at the beginning of the Colorado River. So here, this is a very difficult map to read, so I use a little cartoon here. So you've got the Colorado River forming the western boundary. So that's this area here. It's hard to get water out of the Grand Canyon, not to mention the fact that it is a national park. So the best way to get water would be to get it from Lake Powell. And so what we would like to do is take water from Lake Powell, pump it up out of the basin, and then down into what we call the Western Navajo area. And this is a critical area because everything that is west of this line here, this is the edge of what we call the Echo Cliffs. Everything west, there is no surface water other than the Colorado River. There is no groundwater. Everybody there hauls water because there's no source of water that's available. So we want to get water from the upper basin, bring it to the lower basin for Navajo and Hopi people. We think we've already established that precedent with the New Mexico settlement, with the upper basin resolution saying, okay, if you do this, there is a path for getting water to people when you do an interbasin transfer. So this is still, it's a pipeline that's still a pipe dream that's dependent on a lot of things to happen that haven't happened yet. One of the things that is happening now is the Navajo Nation Council just recently approved a Navajo-Utah water settlement with the state of Utah. And that includes the right to deplete 81,500 acre-feet of surface water and groundwater. The rights may only be used in Utah. And from a drinking water perspective, the project that seems to be the preferred alternative is to actually take the water from New Mexico and transport it into communities in Arizona and then up into communities in Utah. And the reason for that is the San Juan River has a very, very high sediment yield. And so trying to get water for drinking water purposes out of the San Juan River in Utah is a challenge. So we'd like to take it from a place where it's easier to get. And so what would happen is that if we delivered water, we could divert water from New Mexico. I believe Article 9 of the Upper Basin Compact says, no state shall deprive another state of the right to build diversion works in that state for the purpose of providing water to downstream. The only thing that you have to do is account for the water. So water that's used in Arizona has to count against Arizona's upper basin apportionment. Water that's used in Utah has to count against Utah's apportionment. And so we believe that we can use the Upper Basin Compact for that particular purpose. But the Upper Basin Compact's a little more problematic than that. Article 14 of the compact basically reserves the consumptive use of the San Juan River and its tributaries to the states of Colorado and New Mexico. Put another way, the state of Utah does not have an entitlement to the waters in the San Juan River, which means that Navajos in Utah would not be able to call out water users that are upstream in Colorado and New Mexico during times of shortage, because Utah does not have an apportionment. And that sort of came as a surprise to the state of Utah when we were sitting down and trying to negotiate these things. So that's one of the difficulties that's involved in this particular settlement. But look again at the dates here. This is the Upper Basin Compact, 1948. Ask yourself, where was the Navajo Nation in 1948 when the compact was being negotiated? Well, Navajo people in New Mexico and New Mexico and Arizona didn't get the right to vote until 1948. They didn't get the right to vote in Utah until 1953. So again, all these rules were made at a time when Navajos really had absolutely no ability to affect the political process. So these are the challenges that we have. This is the challenges we're facing moving forward, and we're hoping at least we can get this Utah settlement done. So again, going back to the artwork, they started construction on the Navajo Gallup project, and the children responded in kind. Thank you for bringing the water, Obama. So that's a good thing. So with that, I say, yeah, it's been a privilege to speak to you today. I don't know if we have time for questions, but whatever. So thank you.